Okay, so we're going to get started with our final talk before the break. So our next speaker is Dimitry Anastakis. Okay, so Dimitry Anastakis is the L.R. Wilson R.J. Curry Chair in Canadian Business History at the University of Toronto in the Department of History and the Rotman School of Management, where he teaches about business, the state of the state and politics, and globalization, particularly in the post-1945 period in Canada. His most recent book is Dream Car, Malcolm Brickland's Fantastic Safety Vehicle One and the End of Industrial Modernity, and is written as an open road and includes a playlist. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks everybody on the panel. Thanks also to Kirsten Vanstone, who was the one who originally hooked me into this. I'm not a mathematician, and I actually don't know that much about fields, but it was a pleasure to be able to learn an awful lot about him. My presentation is titled Some Glocal Context for the 1924 ICM, Toronto Business and John Charles Fields. And over the next 29 minutes or so, I'd like to situate John Charles Fields in his ICM moment in 1924, paralleling his own work, his career, which has already been spoken about, and his role in the 1924 conference with the local and global business networks that emanated outward from the city of Toronto. By 1924, Toronto and its business milieu were undergoing a transformation as many of the city's firms and families, from the Masseys, the Eatons, and Gooderhams, for example, had become increasingly national and international in scope and aspiration. I want to center Fields in this Toronto context, a city that was changing quickly in terms of its growth in its urban, academic, social, and cultural spaces, but especially its economic status, in particular in its competition with Montreal. Toronto was still the second city, but it was aspiring to really surpass Montreal at that time. As the boisterous 1924 Toronto City Director reported, the city's population had grown from 10,000 in 1834 to a metropolitan city of 709,000 souls, and was today the leading industrial center of Canada, paying annually a larger wage bill than any other city in Canada and using more raw material in its manufacturing processes than any other place. So today, I want to take a walk with you and John Charles Fields as he hosted the ICM in August of 1924, giving us a sense of the university and its urban space in Toronto, but also illuminating Fields' networks with local leaders. Elaine did such an amazing job talking about his networking in Europe and beyond. I want to talk about his networking here in Toronto in relation to fundraising and organizing the conference. Marcus's paper told us about Fields himself. Elaine is focused internationally. I want to talk about how Fields Toronto was itself a reflection of his own international efforts, but also of an aspiring city's business class and Canada's increasingly global outlook and outreach in the 1920s. There's a mutual boosterism that's going on here between Fields and his efforts to bring math and make it bigger, and some of the local boosters and civic and business leaders who are also trying to boost Toronto. This is where the Glocal comes in connecting the local places that we're going to talk about with the broader global story of Toronto's entanglements in the wider world, particularly in terms of its business, economic, and civil leaders who contributed to the conference. So we're going to use this map. This is a selection or a segment of Gode's 1924 fire insurance map of Toronto. This is our way to get around campus and around the city, zooming in on about 5 stops, I think, 5 or 6 stops, which really give us a further explanation and context of the places, people, and firms that were supporting this international endeavor of the 1924 ICM. In 1924, Toronto, often referred to as the Queen City because it was so British, was on the make. This is a city that's trying to really break out of its kind of parochial, backwards, very provincial status and become something more. So is J.C. Fields. This is an entrepreneurial individual who is out in the world trying to build himself, build his city, and build math in Canada. Okay, start off, we'll move over. There's that picture of J.C. Fields. Fields always lived close to the university. In the early 1920s, he lived over here on Huron Street, which many of you probably walked over. He was probably living at 310 Huron in 1924 when the conference happened. We don't know if he ever owned a car. I asked Elaine. She's not sure. Maybe he did. He may have. He probably walked. He might have taken streetcars around the city. Maybe he took a bicycle, probably not at this age, but maybe when he was younger. He would have walked to U of T and walked to all the events that were going on in the conference over this time in August of 1924. Here's an image of the conference delegates, which you've all seen. There is Fields here, over here in the corner, which Elaine's already shown you. And of course, there's a picture outside. That's something that's a picture taken right in front of Convocation Hall, which is down here on our GODES map. This is only a selection of the 444 delegates from 33 countries that took part, but it is a pretty good number of them in terms of how many people were there, and it's a pretty wide-ranging group of people. I want to focus for a minute here on the list of contributors to the conference. As Elaine's already talked about, Fields was pretty good at getting money out of governments, particularly the government of Canada, but also the government of Ontario. He got some money out of institutions like the Carnegie Corporation, U of T. There were subscriptions to date as well. And from this point on, the rest of the list is private people, enterprises, and individuals who are contributing to try to boost the conference, give some money. This is a list that actually comes from the proceedings. I've already flipped to page 69 there in the proceedings, which is where I took it from. And part of the money was obviously intended to help publish the proceedings, which was a complicated and difficult task because they didn't even have the fonts to do it at the University of Toronto. Some of these names will be familiar to you, the Carnegie Corporation, perhaps even Imperial Oil or the Timothy Eaton Company, but some of these names are likely less well known. And I'm hopeful that once we stop and visit with some of these people and places, you'll get a better sense of just how expansive and international these individuals' firms and endeavors really were, which again reflects the similar outward-looking confident approach that Fields took to organizing the conference. This is basically our guidebook, our table of contents for our little tour here around the city. So let's go to our first stop. And Fields himself would have walked probably from up here at 310 Huron Street, along Bloor Street, over here to the corner of St. George and Bloor Street. This is a corner he probably walked by innumerable times in his life. Probably a few of you walked by it too. It's where the TTC St. George subway stop is. And one of the most prominent features of the corner is a big building, a big red building, the York Club. And we've already mentioned the York Club because this is one of the places where an event during the ICM in August was held. Well, the York Club was the spectacular and beautiful Gilded Age home, originally called Waveney and built in 1892 for George Gooderham. George Gooderham was the heir to the distilling, banking, and railroading empire. After he died in 1905, George's home was sold and became the York Club in 1910, of which Fields was a member, which is why there was a garden party for delegates at the York Club from the ICM in August. I think it was August 12th of 1924. The York Club and the Gooderham's family and their business perfectly encapsulate Toronto's growing international connections through enterprise. Founded in 1837, by the late 19th century, Gooderham and Worts was one of the largest distillers in the British Empire, selling their rye whiskey products all across the British Empire and into other places around the world. They did so by ship and by rail, which reflected the kind of international connections that were really expanding from Toronto. During the 1920s, when the conference is going on, is the era of prohibition, where alcohol is technically legal. But the Gooderhams were able somehow to manage to get their booze across the border into the United States, and were doing pretty well in the 1920s. In fact, the year before the conference in 1923, the Gooderham's establishment is purchased by another Canadian, a man by the name of Harry Hatch, who creates a pretty big alcohol empire. It doesn't become as big as the Seagram's empire, but it becomes pretty significant. It's Hiram Walker, which eventually becomes Allied Lions years down the road. Now, it was a Colonel A.E. Gooderham, who's here, right in the middle, who probably was the one that Charles Field spoke to. He's on the list of one of the contributors. He contributed $500 to the ICM, and he was the grandson of the firm's founder, the son of George Goodrum. The York Club was the house that he grew up in, actually, had spent some time in. He was also a booster of Toronto and a booster of the ICM. He would have been keen to support the ICM. This is him in 1916 during the war at the Distillery District, which today still exists and is one of the most interesting agglomerations of 19th century industrial architecture. People go to it now because it's got art galleries and restaurants and shops, and it's a really fascinating place to go visit if you want to take a little walk back into 19th century distilling and manufacturing life in Toronto. Okay, so after the visit to the York Club, Fields would have also had events right in the heart of campus. And this is where we're going to head to next. The heart of campus, the heart of U of T, is really in many ways symbolized by Hart House, H-A-R-T, Hart House, which was the location on August 12th of 1924, of, as Elaine's already pointed out, of the Conversazione, sorry, my apologies. Hart House was the location of this event. It was the sprawling new student center built by the Massey Family Foundation and opened in 1919 by Vincent Massey, who later became the first Canadian-born Governor General of Canada. In her wonderful book about Fields, Elaine wrote that the delegates walked up the great stone steps and strolled along Hart House corridors, which were hung for the occasion with paintings by Canadian artists. You can see this kind of boosterism that's going on here. Along with the event at Hart House on Saturday, August 16th, at the end of the conference, Field and other conference delegates held a ceremony at the adjacent Soldiers Tower to recognize the over 500 students and faculty from the University of Toronto who had made the ultimate sacrifice in the Great War. And you can feel the Great War really looming over everything that's happening, not just in terms of his efforts to bring the conference here, but what's going on at U of T. Hart House itself is named after Hart Massey, Vincent's grandfather, who had made his farm implements company, started in 1847, into Canada's largest and most successful private enterprise. They're a tractor firm. They build farm implements. By the 1920s, and for much of the 20th century, the Massey Company, Massey Ferguson, was one of Canada's great multinational firms, probably one of its first and most important multinational firms. Their impact upon the city's national, continental, and global place in the world was profound. Even though Massey did not directly support the ICM in 1924, they did in kind by providing the buildings, providing some of the venues for events that were happening throughout the conference, including the Massey Hall, which was built in 1892, where there was an event at the ICM. And of course, you guys visited Massey College, I think on Monday, if I'm correct, which is also another legacy of the Massey family's contributions to the university. This is an image of the Massey factories down on King Street. And at the time, this was probably the largest manufacturing enterprise in the British Empire. The Masseys were pretty successful. And to this day, the Massey brand of tractors is probably the most popular brand of tractors in the world. Another successful manufacturer who also contributed to the ICM in 1924, was a man by the name of Sir Edward Kemp. Sir Edward Kemp, pictured here, standing beside Robert Borden, who was the Prime Minister of Canada up until 1920, yes, 1920, was a manufacturer who had started a business called Kemp Manufacturing, which eventually came the Shipments Made Properly, the Sheet Metal Products Company of Canada. The Sheet Metal Product Company of Canada, up until the 1920s and right into the 1960s, was a consumer goods company that manufactured metal goods, household goods. In a world before plastic, they did all kinds of stuff for your kitchen or for your home, and he was very successful as a manufacturer who had started this business. He contributed $500 to the ICM in 1924, and Fields would have known him, would have talked to him, would have encouraged him to contribute funds to this event. Now, along with being at Hart House, no doubt J.C. Fields would have visited a building right around the corner from Hart House, just on Queen's Park Crescent, a little bit northeast of Hart House itself, which was a place called Holwood House. Holwood House was the home of Sir Joseph Flavel. Joseph Flavel was another one of these Toronto business leaders who J.C. Fields networked with in an effort to try to get as much funding and support as possible. Known as the Pork King of Canada, Flavel had built the William Davies Company into the largest pork producer in the British Empire, and along the way had popularized pea-meal bacon. If anybody's ever had pea-meal bacon, that's where it comes from. Today, the William Davies Company exists as the giant food conglomerate Maple Leaf Foods. And Flavel and its success in making Toronto a pork packing center is one of the reasons that the city had for many names and still has the name Hogtown. There were so many slaughterhouses here, so much pork production that got sent out from Toronto to the world. Flavel was also a banker, and during the First World War had headed the Canadian Imperial Munitions Board. At his death in 1939, this house, Holwood, was donated to the university and became part of the law school. It's known today as Flavel House. In 1924, Flavel gives $500 to J.C. Fields and to the conference. Somebody can right now go onto the Bank of Canada's currency converter and pump it in, and you will find out exactly how much that is. I'm not going to guess. I'm a historian, not an economist, okay? You know, economists always BS it anyways. They'd fake it too. Near Holwood House, actually almost right next door, was another building that J.C. Fields would have visited and undoubtedly been familiar with. This was another Gilded Age mansion called Wimblewood. This was the home of E.R. Wood. Wood was one of Toronto's most successful stockbrokers and was also a contributor to the ICM. He contributed $500 to the event. He was a major investor very early on in the giant utility firm, the Brazilian Traction Light and Power Company, a Toronto-based firm that built most of the utility infrastructure in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro and much of Brazil in the 19th and early 20th century. Today, that firm is known as Brookfield. It's one of the world's largest investment management firms, which still does utilities. Wood, as a stockbroker, was very successful, contributed, but also left as a legacy his home to the University of Toronto, which also became part of the law school, and it is today known as Falconer Hall, named after Robert Falconer, the president that Elaine showed a slide of. That is the heart of the campus, where some of the events, some of the contributors to the ICM were located, and where Fields would have walked and where the delegates would have walked as well. We're going to leave campus now and walk with Fields about 20 minutes south and a little bit further east down to Yonge and Queen Streets, where we're going to visit with Fields to the offices, the buildings, and the department store known as the Timothy Eaton Company. And, you know, Timothy Eaton Company is one of the corporate contributors to the ICM. There's only a few. And the Timothy Eaton Company, for any Canadian of a particular age, will be a very familiar name because they were Canada's department store. They were the most successful, most prominent, and most dynamic department store in Canada for all of the 20th century. They were as indelibly Canadian as hockey, Tim Hortons, and maple syrup, and they dominated the retail landscape of this country. Their founder was Timothy Eaton, who was an Irish immigrant who came to Canada in 1852, and in 1869 opened a dry goods store on Yonge Street at 178 Yonge Street. Eaton was very innovative in the way he did his retail operations in terms of his purchasing, his store designs, his sales policies. And by the mid-1920s, when this conference is going on, Eaton's is accounting for about 60% of all retail sales in Canada, 60%. Okay, today, Amazon does like 8%, Walmart might do 7 or 8%, to give you an idea of the scale of just how powerful Eaton's was at this time. And it does so primarily through its operations in Toronto. The Eaton's family owns pretty much everything on one side of Yonge Street from Queen Street all the way to College, which constitutes today the Eaton Centre. Even though the company went under in 1997, they kept the name of the mall that the Eaton's family had built because it was such a successful brand. The Eaton Centre today is the most visited mall in all of North America. It gets over 50 million people a year, and it competes with Disney World as one of the most visited tourist attractions in North America as well. Along with all this, some of the things that the Eaton's family did was inventing the Santa Claus Parade. The first corporate Santa Claus Parade is an Eaton's company venture that comes out in 1905. In 1924, the year of the ICM, Macy's in New York steals Eaton's idea of a Santa Claus Parade to create the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. And it's a direct ripoff of the success of the Eaton's company. Another thing that the Eatons do, and they're incredibly well known for and famous for, is their catalog. Along with the Sears Company in the United States, Eaton's creates a catalog which is incredibly successful in being Amazon before Amazon in terms of providing delivery services of goods to everywhere across the country. And much of that stuff is purchased from outside of Canada. In securing the $500 for the ICM, Fields would have undoubtedly dealt with and connected and knew R.Y. Eaton, Robert Young Eaton, who was the founder's nephew who had taken over the firm in 1922 when the founder's son had suddenly passed away. Again, another example of the networking that Fields is doing, the international breadth of the connections that he's dealing with. Another point on this stop, another quick point on this stop, down at Queen and Yonge Street, right across from Eaton's, is a competitor to Eaton's, the Robert Simpson Company, which is another well-known Canadian department store that goes out of business in the 1980s. The leader of that store, C.L. Burton, also contributed to the ICM, and he's on the list of contributors for another 100. So you see this competition amongst these boosters. Okay, we're going to head a little bit further south, down to the intersection of King and Bay, the heart of Toronto's financial and business district. In the mid-1920s, Toronto had not yet outgrown Montreal as Canada's first city, but it was very much aspiring to do so, and it was already making strides. In the 1920s, already the Toronto Stock Exchange is just about to surpass Montreal Stock Exchange, in part because of the boom of extractive gold, silver, cobalt. The stuff that's going on up in Northern Ontario is now having an impact. And the Toronto Stock Exchange is today the world's largest mining index. And a lot of this is starting to happen in the mid-1920s when Fields is walking around King and Bay looking for contributions. And one of the first places that he would have gone to was the Toronto Star Building on King Street West. This is where the First Canadian Place stands. First Canadian Place is still the largest building, one of the largest buildings in Canada. It's the Bank of Montreal's head office. I always say to my students, yes, this is the power of Toronto. The Bank of Montreal is headquartered in Toronto. So is the Bank of Nova Scotia, headquartered in Toronto. That's where Fields would have met with Joseph E. Atkinson, the newspaper's imperious editor, who had been the Toronto Star's editor from 1899 right up until his death in 1946. And he too was a Toronto booster. This is him, they're taking a picture of him because he's taking part in the first transatlantic phone call in 1927 from a private enterprise before this becomes a common thing. It really reflects the kind of national and outward-looking aspirations for the city and the country. And Joseph E. Atkinson is also a contributor on the list of contributors to the ICM in 1924 of $500. Now, at King and Bay, there's not just newspapers. There's an increasing number of banks, investment banks, brokerage establishments, and other types of financial service firms, including insurance firms. On King Street also, though, was the headquarters of, oops, sorry, wrong one. the headquarters of the Imperial Oil Company of Canada. I don't know why it's not doing that. Okay, I'm just going to leave it like that. It's being persnickety. Imperial Oil is one of the corporate contributors to the ICM. They give $500. And Imperial Oil at that time was a firm that had been founded in 1880 in London, Ontario, but in 1898 had been taken over by John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, his trust, and had become a wholly owned subsidiary of Standard Oil. In the 1920s, at the emergence of the automobile, Imperial Oil is a booming, growing firm because of the growth of so much demand for gasoline at that time. Toronto and Imperial Oil's headquarters in Toronto are also international in the sense that Esso, Standard Oil, uses Toronto to purchase other firms around the world, including in Latin America. So you can see Toronto as a base reaching out from Canada to connect internationally and globally around the oil business. Toronto's not a bad place to work if you're in the oil business and you're working, I don't know why it's doing that, and you're working at Imperial Oil. One person who works at Toronto's Imperial Oil headquarters in the 1910s is a man by the name of Walter Teagle, who actually succeeds John D. Rockefeller and takes over the Standard Oil Company in the 1920s and the 1930s. You can see the internationalism, the growth, and the boosterism that's going on in Toronto in this period. One more stop along King Street, which I'm not going to show as an image, but along King Street were also the offices of Arthur Ames, who is also on the list of contributors, having donated $100. Ames was one of Toronto's most successful stock and bond traders and had led the country's Victory Bond campaign during the First World War. His firm eventually became part of Dominion Securities, which became the largest brokerage firm in the country, and it was eventually bought by the Royal Bank of Canada. Both Ames and the previously mentioned E.R. Wood were colleagues and contemporaries with a man by the name of Sir Henry Pellet. And that's another Toronto financier whose name might be familiar. In the 1920s, Henry Pellet had become very much overextended in his railways, electricity, real estate, and mining interests, and had fallen on hard times. He is not on the list of contributors to the ICM because he's in the middle of going bankrupt, unfortunately. Now, some of you might know who he is indirectly because he is the person who built Casa Loma, was building Casa Loma. And by 1924, while the conference is going on, he's actually declared bankruptcy and is no longer living in the castle. Him and his wife have moved up north. That actually, I think in 1922, and Casa Loma is sitting there empty. Eventually the city takes it over because it's so expensive to run. Okay, well, I hope that you have enjoyed my dizzying walk with J.C. Fields across Toronto. My aim was to provide a little bit of a taste of what Toronto was like at this time in the 1924 ICM, and hopefully shed some light on the contributors and the connections that they were making with J.C. Fields and the conference, and how that reflected the kind of boosterism and international connections that were very much a part of what J.C. Fields was trying to accomplish, not just with the conference, but in his own career and in boosting mathematics and the academy in Canada. They reflected, like Fields himself, a prosperous, internationally inclined, and aspiring British-Canadian city in the interwar era. Thank you.